Picture this: the most powerful man in England, a king who could order heads severed with a gesture, lying helpless in his own filth. His leg wound oozes thick, yellow pus that soaks through bandage after bandage. The stench is so overwhelming that courtiers hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when forced to approach his bedside. This isn't some nameless prisoner in a dungeon. This is Henry VIII, and his own body has become his cruelest executioner. For over a decade, the king who had terrorized Europe's courts would experience a slow, humiliating descent into physical decay that no royal physician could cure, no amount of wealth could heal, and no exercise of absolute power could stop. His death wouldn't come swiftly like the victims of his rage, but would stretch across years of mounting agony, each day bringing fresh indignities to a man who had never known helplessness. The irony was cosmic in its precision. Henry had made his reign a theater of bodily destruction, heads rolling, flesh burning, bodies quartered and displayed. Now his own flesh would betray him in the most grotesque ways imaginable, turning the king's very existence into a daily reminder of mortality's triumph over earthly power. To understand the full horror of Henry's decay, we must first grasp what he had been. In his youth, Henry VIII stood as Europe's most magnificent prince. 6 feet 2 inches of athletic prowess, with a chest that measured 54 inches and legs powerful enough to dominate any tournament ground. Ambassadors wrote breathlessly to their courts about this golden giant who could outdance, outfight, and outthink any challenger. He was the Renaissance prince incarnate. Henry spoke 4 languages fluently, composed music that courtiers genuinely enjoyed, and wrote theological treatises that impressed scholarly minds across the continent. When he rode into the lists for a joust, crowds would roar their approval. Here was kingship made flesh, young, vital, seemingly invincible. But power has its own appetites, and Henry fed them without restraint. Royal feasts became legendary spectacles where dozens of courses were served and the king's plate never emptied. Contemporary accounts describe meals lasting hours, with Henry consuming quantities that amazed even gluttonous courtiers. Sweet wines, rich meats, elaborate desserts. The royal appetite seemed as boundless as royal authority. The transformation began gradually. Court portraits from the 1520s show a king whose athletic frame was softening, whose face was rounding. By the 1530s, Henry required specially reinforced chairs and had to be helped onto his horse. The Golden Prince was becoming something else entirely, a mountain of flesh that strained royal tailors and worried royal physicians. Yet even as his body expanded, Henry's appetites only grew more voracious. Food wasn't the only excess. His hunger for wives, for land, for absolute control over every aspect of English life seemed to mirror his physical consumption. It was as if the man who could devour kingdoms was being devoured from within by his own desires. Contemporary observers noted the change with growing alarm. The Venetian ambassador wrote that the king had grown so stout that 3 men of ordinary size could fit inside his doublet. But no one dared suggest that Henry moderate his habits. After all, this was a man who had proven willing to execute anyone who displeased him, including 2 of his wives. The stage was set for catastrophe. A body pushed beyond all reasonable limits, inhabited by a mind that recognized no constraints, governing a court where no one dared speak uncomfortable truths. When disaster finally struck, it would come not from foreign enemies or domestic rebellion, but from the king's own flesh. The accident that changed everything. January 24th, 1536, Greenwich Palace. The tournament ground where Henry had dominated for decades would become the site of his undoing. At 44, the king was still insisting on competing against men half his age, his massive frame now requiring specially reinforced armor that weighed over 90 pounds. The accident happened with sickening suddenness. Henry's opponent, likely overwhelmed by the prospect of potentially injuring his sovereign, failed to break his lance properly. The impact sent both men crashing to the ground, but Henry's tremendous weight turned what should have been a routine tumble into something far more devastating. For 2 hours, the king lay unconscious. Court physicians rushed to his side, but their primitive understanding of head trauma left them essentially helpless. When Henry finally regained consciousness, those around him noticed troubling changes. His memory seemed affected. His famous temper, already formidable, became explosive and unpredictable. But it was the leg injury that would prove most consequential. The heavy armor had driven deep into Henry's left thigh, creating a wound that contemporary accounts describe as grievous. In an age before antiseptics or proper surgical technique, such injuries were death sentences waiting to unfold. The royal physicians applied their standard treatments: poultices, bloodletting, prayers. The wound appeared to heal, and for a time, court life returned to normal. Henry resumed his daily routines, though observers noted he moved more carefully and tired more easily. Then the wound reopened. What had seemed like successful healing was actually the beginning of a decade-long nightmare. The tissue around the injury had never properly mended, and the chronic inflammation was setting the stage for an infection that would never truly heal. Modern medical experts examining the evidence believe Henry developed osteomyelitis, a bone infection that can persist for years, constantly breaking down and reforming tissue. The smell was the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Courtiers began to notice a sweet, sickly odor emanating from the king's leg. Then came the discharge, thick yellow pus that soaked through bandages and stained royal garments. The wound would seem to heal, only to reopen weeks or months later, each time worse than before. Henry's physicians tried everything their limited knowledge could suggest. They packed the wound with honey, applied hot poultices, even attempted crude surgical drainage. Nothing worked for long. The infection had established itself in the bone itself, where no Tudor-era treatment could reach it. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the physical. Henry had built his identity around physical dominance, sexual prowess, and the appearance of divine favor. Now his own body was broadcasting his weakness to anyone who came near. The sweet stench of decay followed him everywhere, a constant reminder that even kings were mortal. Court life began to subtly reorganize itself around the king's condition. Meetings were held upwind of Henry when possible. Courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths during audiences. The perfume industry in London experienced unprecedented demand as everyone at court tried to mask the royal stench. Henry himself seemed torn between denial and rage. Some days he would insist on normal activities, hunting or dancing as if nothing had changed. Other days, the pain would leave him bedridden and snarling at anyone who dared approach. His famous charm was increasingly replaced by suspicious irritability. The wound became a barometer of royal mood. When the infection flared, Henry's temper became volcanic. Servants learned to read the signs, the particular way the king held his leg, the grimace that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. On bad days, wise courtiers found reasons to be elsewhere. By 1540, the pattern was established. The wound would seem to heal, giving everyone hope that the nightmare was ending. Then, inevitably, it would reopen, often worse than before. Each cycle left Henry weaker, more irritable, and more paranoid. The man who had once seemed larger than life was being consumed from within by his own corrupted flesh. The body's rebellion. As the 1540s progressed, Henry's leg wound was no longer his only medical crisis. His body had become a catalogue of ailments, each feeding into the others in a cascade of physical breakdown that even royal physicians recognized as beyond their ability to treat. The king's weight had ballooned to an estimated 320 pounds. His waist, once trim and athletic, now measured 57 inches. Contemporary accounts describe a man so massive that he required mechanical devices to move between floors of his palaces. The famous Whitehall lifting chair, essentially a primitive elevator, was installed specifically to accommodate Henry's inability to climb stairs. His legs could no longer support his bulk. Beyond the festering wound, both limbs had developed a network of ulcers and sores. These new wounds appeared without trauma, opening spontaneously as his circulation failed and his immune system collapsed under the strain of chronic infection. Each sore followed the same pattern as the original injury, a brief period of apparent healing followed by renewed breakdown and putrefaction. The stench had become legendary. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports back to their courts describing the overwhelming smell that surrounded the English king. The Venetian ambassador noted that even from across a large hall, Henry's presence was unmistakable. The sweet, cloying odor of rotting flesh mixed with the various perfumes and medications applied to mask it, creating what one witness called the most offensive atmosphere imaginable. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms suggests Henry was developing what we now recognize as type 2 diabetes. His enormous appetite, constant thirst, and frequent urination all point to this diagnosis. The poor wound healing, susceptibility to infection, and circulation problems that plagued his later years are classic complications of uncontrolled diabetes. But perhaps most disturbing was the way Henry's body seemed to be liquefying from within. Court records describe periodic evacuations when the king's ulcers would suddenly drain massive quantities of fluid. These episodes left him temporarily lighter and more mobile, but also weaker and more prone to infection. The royal physicians were baffled. Their understanding of medicine was still rooted in medieval concepts of humors and divine punishment. They prescribed bloodletting to balance his humors, not realizing this further weakened his already compromised system. They applied mercury-based ointments that may have caused additional tissue damage. Their surgical interventions, performed without antiseptics or proper technique, likely introduced new infections. Henry's daily routine became a carefully choreographed dance around his physical limitations. He was lifted from bed by multiple servants, then carefully positioned in specially designed chairs that could accommodate his bulk while keeping pressure off his worst ulcers. His clothing had to be changed multiple times daily as the discharge from his wounds soaked through successive layers of bandages and fabric. The psychological toll was evident to anyone who observed him closely. The king, who had once commanded through charisma and physical presence, now ruled through fear alone. His temper had become genuinely unpredictable. Servants could find themselves facing execution for minor infractions that would have been laughed off in earlier years. Sleep became elusive. The pain from his ulcers was constant, but it was the smell that truly tormented him. Henry was fully aware of how repulsive he had become. Court records show him ordering ever stronger perfumes and incense, desperately trying to mask the evidence of his decay. His appetite, paradoxically, remained enormous. Even as his body was literally rotting around him, Henry continued to consume massive quantities of food. Modern psychologists might recognize this as a form of comfort eating, but his physicians interpreted it as a sign of returning health. They encouraged his gluttony, not understanding that they were feeding the very conditions that were killing him. The king's mobility became so limited that special arrangements had to be made for court functions. Thrones were positioned to hide his legs, and carefully orchestrated seating plans ensured that other courtiers weren't subjected to the full force of his odor. When Henry had to move between rooms, the route was cleared and windows opened to disperse the smell as quickly as possible. Perhaps most tragically, Henry seemed aware of his condition's hopelessness. Court observers noted periods of deep melancholy when the king would stare at his bandaged legs with an expression of profound despair. These moments of clarity, when the fog of pain and medication lifted enough for him to fully comprehend his situation, may have been more torturous than the physical agony itself. By December 1546, even Henry's iron will could no longer deny the reality of his condition. The man who had terrorized Europe for nearly 4 decades was dying by degrees, his body staging a final, comprehensive rebellion against the mind that had driven it so mercilessly. The leg ulcers had multiplied and deepened. What had once been isolated wounds were now interconnected craters that exposed bone and sinew. The smell had become so overpowering that servants assigned to the king's personal care had to be rotated frequently, not from choice, but because prolonged exposure left them violently ill. New symptoms appeared with alarming frequency. Henry began experiencing severe swelling throughout his body, particularly in his face and extremities. His breathing became labored, forcing him to sleep propped upright on multiple pillows. Contemporary accounts describe a man whose skin had taken on a grayish pallor, broken by angry red patches where infection had spread. The king's mental state fluctuated wildly between lucidity and confusion. Some days he would conduct business with his usual sharp intelligence, reviewing documents and making decisions that showed his mind remained formidable. Other days, courtiers would find him staring blankly at the ceiling, seemingly unaware of their presence. His physicians had essentially given up any pretense of treatment. Their daily routine consisted of draining the worst ulcers, applying fresh bandages, and administering increasingly potent mixtures of alcohol and opium to manage his pain. The royal apartments had been converted into what amounted to a medieval intensive care unit, with teams of servants working in shifts to manage the king's basic needs. The political implications were staggering. England's government effectively ground to a halt as Henry became too ill to make decisions or receive visitors. His closest advisors began the delicate process of governing in his name while preparing for a succession that everyone knew was imminent but no one dared discuss openly. By early January 1547, Henry was largely bedridden. The effort of sitting upright left him gasping for breath, and the pain from his ulcers had reached levels that defeated even the strongest medications available. Court records from this period describe a man who would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to recognize visitors, other times lost in delirium. The smell had become so intense that it permeated the entire wing of Whitehall Palace, where Henry was housed. Servants reported that the odor clung to their clothing and hair for days after attending to the king. Even the stone walls seemed to have absorbed the stench of his decay. His appetite finally began to fail, perhaps the clearest sign that the end was approaching. The man who had consumed enormous meals throughout his illness suddenly couldn't tolerate even simple broths. His body was shutting down systematically, each organ system failing as the chronic infection overwhelmed his remaining reserves. Modern medical analysis suggests Henry was experiencing multi-organ failure. His kidneys, compromised by years of diabetes and infection, were no longer effectively filtering toxins from his blood. His heart, strained by decades of supporting massive weight while fighting chronic infection, was failing. His liver, damaged by years of alcohol consumption and now poisoned by bacterial toxins, was ceasing to function. The final weeks were marked by periods of semi-consciousness, interrupted by moments of startling clarity. During these lucid intervals, Henry seemed to understand exactly what was happening to him. He made arrangements for his son's regency, signed his final will, and received last rites. But he also raged against his fate with the same fury that had characterized his entire reign. Court observers noted that even as his body failed, Henry's ego remained intact. He refused to admit weakness, insisting that he was merely suffering from a temporary setback. When physicians dared suggest that his condition was grave, he would fly into rages that left him exhausted and gasping. The king's final conscious act was reportedly an attempt to sign a document with his own hand. His signature, once bold and confident, had deteriorated into a barely legible scrawl. The effort left him so drained that he lapsed into the semi-comatose state from which he would never fully emerge. Death and decay. The end came on the night of January the 27th to 28th, 1547, but not with the dramatic flourishes that had marked Henry's life. There were no stirring final words, no deathbed conversions, no peaceful acceptance of mortality. Instead, the king simply stopped breathing sometime in the early morning hours, his exhausted body finally surrendering to the infections that had been consuming it for over a decade. The immediate aftermath revealed just how completely Henry's physical condition had deteriorated. When royal physicians examined his body, they found a man who was literally rotting from within. The leg ulcers had eaten through to the bone in several places. His abdomen was distended with fluid, and his skin had taken on the waxy gray appearance of advanced tissue death. But perhaps most shocking was the sheer volume of discharge that had accumulated within his body. When the royal embalmers attempted to prepare Henry for burial, they discovered that his corpse was essentially a shell containing vast quantities of infected fluid. The embalming process, already challenging due to his enormous size, became a nightmare of drainage and reconstruction. Court protocol demanded that Henry's death be kept secret until political arrangements could be finalized. For 3 days, his decomposing corpse remained in his chambers, while advisors maneuvered to ensure a smooth transition to his son, Edward VI. During this period, the smell emanating from the royal apartments became so overwhelming that sections of Whitehall Palace had to be evacuated. The challenge of moving Henry's body proved almost insurmountable. His corpse, bloated with decomposition gases and bodily fluids, weighed an estimated 400 pounds. Specially reinforced coffins had to be constructed, and teams of pallbearers were needed just to lift the casket. Even then, the weight distribution was so problematic that the procession had to move slowly to prevent structural failure. The most macabre chapter in this saga occurred during the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle. Contemporary accounts, while lacking in precise detail, suggest that Henry's hastily prepared corpse began to leak during transport. The combination of decomposition gases, residual infection, and the physical stress of movement caused bodily fluids to seep through the coffin seals. By the time the funeral cortege reached Windsor, witnesses reported that the coffin was visibly stained and emitting such a powerful odor that mourners had to keep their distance. The lead-lined casket, designed to contain the royal remains for eternity, had been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of corruption within. Protestant writers of the following decades seized upon these details as evidence of divine judgment. They portrayed Henry's physical corruption as a manifestation of his spiritual state, arguing that God had literally rotted the king from within as punishment for his sins. While these interpretations were clearly shaped by religious bias, the basic facts they referenced appear to have been accurate. The burial itself had to be rushed. Plans for an elaborate ceremony were abandoned in favor of a quick interment that would end the logistical nightmare of dealing with Henry's decomposing remains. Even in death, the king who had demanded absolute control over every aspect of English life was being controlled by the fundamental reality of biological decay. Modern medical experts examining the historical record believe Henry's rapid post-mortem decomposition was accelerated by several factors. His chronic infections had essentially pre-digested much of his tissue, creating ideal conditions for bacterial proliferation after death. His enormous size made proper preservation virtually impossible with Tudor-era techniques. Most significantly, the decade of chronic ulceration had created multiple pathways for contamination to spread throughout his body. The irony was lost on no one who knew the full story. Henry VIII, who had built his reign on displays of physical power and had used his authority to dismember so many others, had been dismembered by his own flesh. The king who had ordered countless heads severed had watched his own body betray him piece by piece. The monarch who had burned heretics alive had spent his final years experiencing his own form of slow combustion from within. In death, Henry VIII achieved a form of equality that had been denied to him in life. No amount of royal privilege could prevent the fundamental process of decay. No exercise of absolute power could command his flesh to heal. No political maneuvering could negotiate with the bacteria consuming him from within. The man who had reshaped England through sheer force of will had been reshaped by forces entirely beyond his control. His legendary appetite, which had once seemed like a symbol of his larger-than-life nature, had literally consumed him. His pursuit of absolute power had culminated in absolute helplessness. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henry's death was how thoroughly it revealed the performance of kingship. For over a decade, courtiers had maintained elaborate pretenses around the king's condition. They had endured the stench, ignored the obvious signs of decay, and participated in a collective denial of biological reality. The divine right of kings, it turned out, included the right to rot in public while everyone pretended not to notice. The precedent Henry set would echo through the centuries. Rulers who believed themselves above natural law, leaders who confused their temporary authority with permanent invincibility, men who forgot that power was borrowed rather than owned. History would repeat this pattern countless times. The mighty brought low, not by their enemies, but by their own flesh. Modern medical science allows us to understand Henry's suffering in ways his contemporaries never could. We can diagnose his diabetes, chart the progression of his bone infections, and explain the cascade of organ failures that finally killed him. But this knowledge, rather than diminishing the horror of his death, actually intensifies it. We know that much of his suffering was preventable, that different choices could have led to different outcomes. The king who had demanded impossible things from everyone around him had ultimately demanded the impossible from his own body. He had pushed past every reasonable limit, ignored every warning sign, and refused to acknowledge the constraints that govern all human flesh. In the end, his greatest enemy wasn't foreign invasion or domestic rebellion. It was the simple biological fact that human bodies have limits, even royal ones. Henry's rotting leg became the perfect metaphor for his reign. What had started as a minor injury, easily treatable if properly managed, had grown into a festering corruption that poisoned everything around it. His refusal to accept medical advice paralleled his refusal to accept political constraints. The infection that killed him was, in many ways, a reflection of the infections he had introduced into English society. The stench that followed Henry through his final years serves as perhaps the most fitting symbol of his legacy. Like the smell of his ulcers, the consequences of his actions would linger long after he was gone, affecting everyone who came near. The religious upheaval, the political paranoia, the casual brutality that had characterized his rule, all of these would continue to poison English life for generations. In the end, Henry VIII achieved a form of immortality, but not the kind he had sought. He is remembered not for his early promise or his cultural achievements, but for the grotesque spectacle of his decline. The Golden Prince who had seemed to embody Renaissance ideals became instead a cautionary tale about the costs of unchecked power and unrestrained appetite. His death reminds us that beneath every crown lies a skull, beneath every royal robe lies flesh as vulnerable as any commoner's. The most powerful man in England had learned, too late, that there are some forms of authority that cannot be challenged, some laws that cannot be rewritten, and some enemies that cannot be defeated. In the democracy of death, kings and peasants stand equal, and the only crown that matters is the one worn by the worms.